In my last video, I stated some conditions of women's lives at the beginning of socialism, mostly in regard to family and marriage. Some of the facts I brought up have been challenged. I realized it would be necessary to back up these claims. When PlayStation first asked me for references to these claims, I had assumed Felicia 1717 would come along to drop 1,000,001 links, but immediately realized that he was right about my accusation that women could not hold property, being false, and women being forbidden to work, being false. Felicia did not bother to provide links because she's as fucking useless as a bump on my ass. I mean seriously though, if there is one thing, and one thing only I would ever give her credit for, it's her amazing ability to pull out random female inequalities across culture and history devoid of context. I figured supplying some specific examples and links would be heaven on earth for her. Here she'd be doing her usual boohoo the woman's shtick, on an MRA channel, and actually being thanked for it, but then she didn't come through, because she sucks. Felicia, you're fired. You're not banned or anything, but as my troll, you're fired. So I had to do a lot of research to validate these claims, and my conclusions are as such. I claimed women could not own property. Well, I meant wives, not just women. As far as I can tell, women, single, and adult, could always own property. I will link to wives not being able to hold property, even though that's not what I was challenged on. Next, I claimed women could be forced into prostitution. Well, I hadn't googled long for references, turning up nothing but feminist hand-wringing using vague terminology, when it suddenly dawned on me, this can't be true, at least not under law. No matter how much exclusive rights to a person you have, you cannot legally make them break the law, since this would be an extension of self-breaking the law. So no, in times and countries where prostitution was illegal, neither father nor husband could lawfully force a woman into prostitution. However, what about in times and countries when prostitution was legal? Well, I am unable to find anything considering that with the Google method, that type of keyword deduction to find a relevant article is a fruitless endeavor, though you can probably rule out that a husband could do this as it would break the marital vow, and thus be illegal. But could a father do such a thing? I honestly don't know. But it would seem that throughout most of European history, prostitution was a crime, and if such an opportunity was available for this, it would afford him the right to force his son into prostitution as well. So long answer short, no, women were not forced into prostitution. Next, I claimed husbands could beat their wives. This is mostly what I've spent time trying to verify. This one is confusing, and subjective. In America, no, a husband could not by law hit his wife. However, the rule of thumb myth was often brought up, sometimes victorious, though technically it should never have held up, as no such common law actually existed. But the myth of this common law did play a part in the courts, in some cases, and especially in the illiterate communities where a wife, beaten, would believe he held a lawful right to do so. I suppose a case could be made that up until 1870 in the USA, it was believed to be true by the people. In the UK, this was allegedly a part of English common law. A quick understanding is, William Blackstone wrote in the 18th century in the Commentaries on the Laws of England, the husband also, by the old law, might give his wife moderate correction, for, as he is to answer for her misbehavior, the law thought it reasonable to entrust him with the power of restraining her, by domestic chastisement. But, with us, in the polite reign of Charles II, this power of correction began to be doubted, and a wife may now have security of the peace against her husband, or, in return, a husband against his wife. Yet the lower rank of people, who were always fond of the old common law, still claim and exert their ancient privilege, and the courts of law will still permit a husband to restrain a wife of her liberty, in case of any gross misbehavior. Now in this, notice that the husband, according to alleged old law, was able to within reason hit his wife, but this was also because if the wife misbehaved, such as breaking certain laws, he could be in trouble for his wife's crime. Picture it like this, if a 10-year-old child throws a rock through someone's window, it is not the child who has to pay for the window, it is the parent. If a child steals from a store, the punishment, depending on circumstance, falls either partially or fully on the parent. Same with a wife. If the wife misbehaved, it was the husband that often bared the legal responsibility. So the husband had a certain duty to keep his wife behaved, as a parent is expected to keep their child well behaved. The old common law allowed a man to discipline his wife and children, within reason, as determined by court. Note that it was not illegal for a child to hit parent or wife to hit husband. So technically, according to my understanding, which is admittedly limited, husbands had more restrictions than their wives in regards to physical abuse. So in theory, a wife could beat her husband senseless, whereas a husband could only deliver moderate punishment within reason. Husbands at the time were permitted to force their wives into sex, rape. However, it was also permitted that a wife rape her husband, and even to this day, I do believe a wife can rape her husband, since it is not believed that a grown woman can physically commit rape against an adult man, because a rape is penetration of the vagina by a penis, a thing women lack. And I will link to that. Not linked to women are people without penises, but that the FBI does not consider a man capable of being raped by a woman. However, impotence, vows of chastity, disrespecting vows of chastity, impotence, physical abuse, failure to provide for, failure to obey, public misconduct, slander, defamation of character, and many other things of this nature, while legal for husband and wife to do, were all grounds for divorce. So it works like this: could a husband rape his wife? By law, yes, but she could instantly file for divorce on this grounds and no longer be subject to his rape. Could a husband hit his wife? Yes and no and kinda sorta, but was grounds for divorce, so that it only need happen once. And this is one of the things that makes figuring out these laws difficult. Back in the olden days, and across European cultures, courts barely interfered with the lives of people's private affairs. Marriage was recognized by government, but was mostly a church-based thing subject to its own rules. That's my best understanding of the wife beating and raping situation, and we'll have links below. My conclusion is, inconclusive. It's a lot of gray area. Certainly an argument could be made that men could beat their wives. However, when feminists bring this up, they, as always, fail to mention the context of these things. Again, such things as a wife could beat her husband, a wife could rape her husband, though I am not sure forcible rape of husband would ever realistically be a common thing. And today, and I think even back in the day of pre-feminism, a woman could divorce her husband if he couldn't get an erection, and that a husband could be sent to jail for his wife's bad behavior and forced to pay debts she accumulated. They forget to mention those things, and thereby paint a false picture of privileged men and victimized women. Next, I claimed men could sell their wives. It hadn't been that long ago I read about this phenomenon. However, upon reinvestigation, it turns out I missed a key component. It was never actually fully legal, just mostly overlooked, but sometimes prosecuted, and in a few cases actually upheld by a court, but nonetheless, never a fully legal thing. To be fair, there were cases where judges did not prosecute the husband for the selling of his wife, and some, at least one I have documented, case where a judge ruled that a man could not purchase back his wife, thereby solidifying the legality of the new husband's ownership of the purchased wife. Wife selling went up and down in popularity, and never technically legal even in rare cases where judges basically just threw it out of court or upheld the transaction as final, without lawful grounds to do so. So my conclusion, wife selling was illegal, not that common, though it had some grey area in its legality, often just being overlooked. Next, I claimed that fathers could sell their daughters into marriage. This would seem to be mostly my misunderstanding of bride price and dowry laws. Most famously, this took place in India and China anyhow, since neither feminism nor socialism's early development occurred in these countries. I am discounting this. It is my vague understanding that old Europe had practiced bride price and dowry, though trying to find detailed information such as frequency, specific laws, and date of common practice in Europe, and how protected by law this was, is hard to come by. Ultimately, I give up. I honestly don't know if fathers could sell their daughters. I have read through feminist literature references to them being able to do this, though I cannot recall the exact feminist literature, in what countries they spoke of, in what time period, and whether it was a practice or whether it was a lawful practice. Even attempting to study the rules of bride price and dowry in India and China is difficult because these cultures are so incredibly old, that the customs and legality has changed so much. Some of the feminist literature on marriage consent laws, by early American feminists, make references to things that imply in America a girl could be sold as a bride, against her will, though in America, I seriously cannot find evidence for this ever being lawful. I can't even find evidence that selling children at any point in America was lawful, outside of slavery. So in conclusion, I don't know, and if I don't know, then I can't make the claim. Next, I said women were property. I don't have a link for this, but on investigation, this is a grey area. Wives, not women, were dependents. She was for the most part, and only with the mildest exaggeration, a child. So she was property in the way that a child was property, mostly, but not completely, and always with the option to divorce. To what extent are children property? This is hard to determine. It gets wrapped up in both the semantics of property and a tangled web of laws. Were children property? Yes, but not in the same way a candlestick was property. Were wives property in the way children were? More or less, but not completely. They existed as a cross between adult and child. I'm sorry I can't find any one link clarifying this. It's a confusing issue. Conclusion: wives, not adult single women, were property depending on your definition of property. Next, PlayStation wanted me to offer proof that women could not work. No law existed to prevent them, and I didn't mean it to sound that way, but corporations and academia were free to discriminate and often did, which is how I meant to say it. So let's cover the conclusions of my statements. Women, by law, could not work. False. Women could not own property. False. Wives could not own property. True. Husbands could beat wives. Somewhat true. Husbands could force wives into prostitution. False. Fathers could force daughters into prostitution. False. Husbands could sell wives. False. Fathers could sell daughters as brides. I don't know. Single adult women were property. False. Wives were property. Inconclusive and subjective. A question now arises. Where did I get these ideas? I wasn't making them up for the fun of it. So where did I hear these things? After thinking about it for a while, I believe my two biggest sources came from feminist literature, popular hearsay, and biblical passages. Surely the Bible makes no shortage of references to women as chattel with the same rights as a pack animal, but the Bible is a collection of Middle Eastern writings of over 2,000 years ago, with doubtful historical accuracy, and many historically disproven statements. The attitudes expressed in the Bible were not necessarily reflective of the actual laws, and even then would only be relevant to ancient Middle East. And while it can be argued that the Bible has a strong cultural impact, and can serve as an indicator of social attitudes all throughout the Western world and even to this day, this does not mean that the rules handed down by the alleged God were actually written into law, and if modern Christians serve as an example, there is no reason to believe that these commandments were paid any mind. The Christians of today cherry-pick what they feel like believing, so perhaps even during England's most theocratic time period, these commandments were completely disregarded. So the Bible and feminism, backed by common belief, is probably where I was getting these notions and distortions. And I hate to offend anyone, but those are three places in which you ought not try to derive fact from. All of this makes me think of something very important. An understanding of history in relation to gender is a domain exclusively owned by the feminists. Even I, an MRA, seem to have too much of my knowledge of historical gender roles, derived from feminist propaganda, but they are the academic branch in which gender roles, gender equality and gender theory belong to. I hope in the future, MRAs will traipse onto this territory and explore the history of gender roles and rights, from an MRA perspective. It is my hope that the MRM will examine and teach accurate gender history, although in all likelihood, it will place a male advocacy slant on gender history, but at least between MRM and feminist historical gender revisionism, will exist a readily digestible understanding, each side of the coin to draw knowledge from, which will result, in time, in creating an accurate perception of gender throughout history and culture. Now, the point I was trying to make in my video, which still stands, is that socialism was not a philosophy that spontaneously came into being, it was a reaction to a defective system. The system had undergone changes as a result of technology and industrial revolution. Feminism may have very well come from the socialist movement, but it too was a reaction to unjust rules and artificial constraints that were archaic in the face of the modern world. While not all of my details on the circumstances of women in those days were completely accurate, the overall theme of women being deprived of autonomy is still there. It can be argued that a woman only gave up her autonomy if she married. Okay, but that would validate the feminist notion that marriage was slavery. Even if exaggerated, a woman was more a person when unwedded, so I can understand the feminist position on this. And again, this would support my claim that all was not right as rain, and then innocent naive women were hijacked by socialist philosophers. But instead, that the grievances feminists had, were legit, for the most part, and there can be no denying that women were not afforded the same income opportunities, making it very difficult for them to survive outside of marriage. So again, the outside pressures of laws and policy and social attitude, coerced them into marriage. A woman giving up her autonomy, relegating herself to the status of child was the path of least resistance. And while this may have been true in ancient times based on the type of work that was available to people, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, this was becoming forever more an artificial constraint rather than a natural constraint of her biology and environment. In a cruel and brutal world, women didn't mind giving up their autonomy to have a man carve her path for her and carry her. But when living began getting much easier, that's when all of a sudden giving up autonomy began to look more and more like slavery. Again, I may have been a bit off on some of those details in my last video, but the primary theme remains true, and I insist that no amount of voting Republican can put the genie back in the bottle. You can fight communism all you want, in a world where women can live a perfectly prosperous life with the same ease as men. The only thing stopping them would be artificial constraints, and those constraints cannot last indefinitely, whereas before, even the artificial constraints, were in sync with a man's constraints and obligations, but most importantly, reinforced by a harsh environment that women couldn't fare well in. Also, I would like to add something I've been thinking about while doing all this studying today. It seems that marriage is an unnecessary institution that society coerces individuals into it. It just seems to me that at every turn, the priests and the politicians are constantly manipulating the laws of the system to make life without marriage difficult, as a means to pressure people into getting married. We can see things like removing women from job opportunities in the past, to keep them marrying men for an easier life, the traditionalist conservative effort to get women back in the kitchen, popping out babies. We see the implementation of the Bachelor tax especially in communist nations, which are supposed to be anti-family, as an effort to boost population to feed the socialist system. I just can't help but feel marriage is an artificial solution to problems. The father who wants to unload his financial burden of a daughter onto some surrogate father, corporations that need more human suffering to exploit for cash, the government which needs more taxpayers to shovel a portion of their corporate earned income into the system. I can't figure out the church's motives, other than possibly their dualistic struggle with sex. On one hand, sex is the strongest human desire, naturally this is the one we're told to feel the most guilt over, and the churches would love to condemn sex as the most wicked human act, but realize sex is required to produce offspring, so they say sex is pure evil, unless you get married by us, the church, and produce many children, but no fucking for fun, you sinner. The American, and probably UK as well, courts love the cash that comes with divorce. You have an entire marriage divorce industry profiting off of marriage, an infinite supply of marriage propaganda including silliness like married men live longer and married men are happier, and these statistics are deliberately compiled to mislead people. We hear that marriage is a sacred institution. I think it's only sacred because there is an effort to force it as something sacred. I hear that marriage is a natural proper human activity. Well, if it's so natural, why move mountains and the stars in the heavens, to twist people's arm, to coerce them into marriage? Why the need for government to crack the whip and manipulate people into marriage? Why the panic attack over a few thousand people online calling themselves MGTOW, and the rise of gay marriage? Why is this hardwired fundamental human instinct so heavily being enforced onto people? If a compulsion is hardwired in the human brain, no effort need to exist to perpetuate it. Sex, for example, is an instinctive drive. Even efforts to get teens to not do it, and practice abstinence instead, can't seem to curb this constant underlying drive. But marriage, hell, you can't offer it, you have to force it, and panic that every little thing will destroy it. Arranged marriages, dowries, bride price, bachelor taxes, legal penalties for one or both parties reneging on this contract. All these things seem to be an act of putting a gun to people's heads to make them do something they don't want to do. And am I the only one who gets an eerie feeling, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, when someone like the critical G says you have a duty, obligation, responsibility, to get married? It's that weird brainwashed pre-programmed response people give. That weird, how can I put this? Have you ever seen the movie Logan's Run? If not, it is one of my favorite movies of all time. Go see it. And for those of you who have, remember the premise of carousel where people get renewed? Yeah, marriage. It's like that weird fucking shit, that strange universally accepted delusion that acts as the center of a culture. It's weird, when people encourage marriage, it feels like that Star Trek The Next Generation episode where the Enterprise crew gets that weird visor that acts like a game, but actually controls the mind of the person wearing it. It's addictive, but needs to be tried, and Wesley doesn't want to, and eventually the weird unnatural insistence that he try it, freaks him out and he becomes suspicious of why everyone is pressuring him to try something, and then things get dangerous for him when he refuses. It's that eerie feeling when someone says it's your duty, your obligation, your responsibility, you have to do it, you can't just walk away. Seriously man, this cult of marriage is freaky, and am I the only one that feels like the term family values is really code for get the fags back in the closet and the women back in the kitchen? Anyhow, I want to thank PlayStation for spotting statements he believed to be inaccuracies and asking me to verify them. I am glad I was prompted to take the time to investigate the claims I was making. In spite of the fact it is somewhat embarrassing to have made some false claims, it is beneficial that I learn my mistakes so that I do not color my perception with false facts, and it is beneficial to the MRM that false facts do not get spread around and blindly repeated. And if any of the claims I have made in this video are false, or I have misinterpreted the sources I linked, do not hesitate to let me know. Again, it is far better for our movement that I be embarrassed with having to fess up to my lack of knowledge than it is for me to pridefully propagate false information. And this is why I love you guys. You don't act as blindly loyal sycophants, you vocalize your disagreement with me, and you call out my errors, and this keeps me strong, keeps me on my toes. I dread to think of becoming one of these YouTubers who bans everyone that doesn't kiss their ass, until they filter out all disagreement and thereby create an echo chamber in which they become egotistic, stagnant, complacent, and do not grow, and will resort to name-calling and excuse-making before confessing ignorance. Thanks for keeping me on my toes.